Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my great pleasure to introduce to you, if you haven't met him before, Aaron Brown of Fishing for Leave. I spent 2 exhausting days with them at the Conservative Party conference. If you think the conference was some sort of a joyride, it's not when you're working with those chaps. Started about 8 o'clock at the morning. If some minister or other was addressing a meeting, he was duly lobbied at that time, and it went on till about 10 o'clock at night. So working very strongly, and we have cooperated with them in the production of our leaflet, which, or the pamphlet, which was mentioned earlier, and to get them technically right. And it's been a real pleasure working with people who are working so very, very hard, and let us hope and pray to extremely good effect, because if devotion to duty had anything to do with it, they'd be home and dry by now. Aaron, please.
Well, thank you very much. I got what I came for, so I can go home now, so that's fine, before I bore you to sleep. And thank you very much, Edward, for a kind introduction. It is true, there's many of us who are behind the scenes, many of you probably also, who are working their socks off to see this home. But sadly, things are travelling in the wrong direction. And that's what I'm here and will conclude with at the end. Very gratifyingly, Edward's given me half an hour to bore you all to tears. So I will use that half an hour to indoctrinate you to my way of thinking, whether you like it or not. So, well, there you go. Well, really, as you all know, fishing is totemic of our enmeshment in the EU. It absolutely is. We were sacrificed in the way in. We've been one of the industries that's been the forefront of our enmeshment in the EU, and we have, as no other industry has, have been bludgeoned to death on the altar of Euro Union. Now, sadly, the government now had one golden opportunity to automatically take back control of one of our nation's greatest resources, and they have abjectly failed on one of the acid tests by cravenly capitulating to the EU's demands for the transition. And let it be remembered, that is a transition that our government asked for. That wasn't the EU. One can't blame them for making the best of the situation for their own interests. Our government has abjectly failed our country by putting us into the state of a vassal, into the position of a vassal state, where we will end up having to do whatever the EU tells us to do. Both sides need each other in respect of trade. It keeps getting conflated, sovereignty and what Brexit truly is about, with trade, as has always been the thing that they've beguiled the project with, to make the British people accept our absorption into a European state. Both sides need each other when it comes to trade. Trade's nothing to do with this project. The EU's putting politics before the trade, and that is something that our establishment have wholly misunderstood from 30 years of willful self-delusionment as to what the EU project's about. And what is now becoming a hollow cry of no deal is better than a bad deal in Parliament should be the case, but the establishment that we are governed under just now are ill-disposed to pursuing our national interest and our national benefit. In fact, many of them even revile that idea. We've met civil servants, we've even met MEPs who say, oh, but darlings, you couldn't possibly take back the resources. Think of the poor French fishermen. Where was the thoughts for our poor fishermen when 60% of our fleet was smashed to pieces in Denmark? Now, following Sunday's demonstrations that we conducted, some of you may have come along to support it. We thank CIB for pushing it, and many of the other Brexit groups, Labour, Leave EU. And that shows how many people turned out at such short notice, and what was organised at such short notice, that people are still passionate for the fight. But there is nothing just now for them to galvanise behind. Too many of us are speaking to ourselves and preaching to converted. Too many nice letters in the Telegraph don't do the distance. It is now crucially important, as we are trying to do with Fishing for Leave, to go back up through the gears to push Brexit, to push Britain over the finishing line of getting out of Europe before a political establishment who have wanted to surrender this country to the EU for 40 years managed to negate Brexit to the point of being meaningless. Now, it's important after that that the Brexiteer MPs, indeed any MPs, pay heed to not only the fishermen, but the thousands of public and people in the towns that these demonstrations were conducted who turned out to support in the quaysides at short notice. All those from the industry made a huge effort to do it. It's now time for the other Brexiteers to do so also, to go back onto the front foot. We saw so many younger folk at those demonstrations. We have pictures of the evidence as well, and they're not photoshopped to take the wrinkles out. And that is a huge, they don't need to Photoshop this audience, there's no wrinkles present here at all. So, we have there green shoots with the young folk that came out, if they can be nurtured. Ours isn't a dying industry because it's no longer efficient to catch fish. In fact, catching fish is probably the most efficient form of food production in the world. All we are being crucified for, and deliberately crucified for, is on the altar of the European project. There's nothing to stop Britain to have one of the world-leading fishing nations in the world, the equivalent of Norway, the equivalent of Iceland. We have grounds equal, if not which surpass those nations. But it has been absolutely squandered on the altar of Euro Union. That is what we can get back. Now, those were peaceful demonstrations with a bit of black humour. Even when the Remainers chained themselves to the boat, Theresa and May, that we were about to burn. And you should have seen the speed they got off at it when they realised that fishermen didn't pay a hoot for health and safety. I've never seen people move so fast. When someone said, we're going to burn it anyway, mate, you stay there if you want to, it's going up in flames, your choice. I've never seen a lefty move that quickly at all. But those events that we conducted, they weren't just a bit of fun, they weren't a party, they were a full-throated protest. Our communities, the length and breadth of this country, are sick to death of being malevolently and dismissively portrayed as being justifiably expendable when we're anything but. Fishing's a primary wealth-generating industry. It provides food security and it provides employment, not just in fishing, but in the processing and ancillary industries in rural and coastal areas. I would like the MPs to show how much they are worth as a net contributor to our economy every year, because unlike them that are a drain, we contribute to people's livelihoods and well-being. Now, repatriating our fishing grounds, and the 60% of the fish the EU catches in our waters, yes, that is 60%, is worth a potential 6 to 8 billion, not 6.8, 6 to 8 billion. It will vary from year to year in prices and stock levels and all the rest of it, but that is the amount of money that can be repatriated automatically on withdrawal from the EU. It is a tremendous opportunity worth tens of thousands of jobs. Yet, even when the protests were going on around the country, Theresa May was in Denmark gibbering on about fair and reciprocal access for Denmark's fishermen in our waters post-Brexit. Now, I would wager that Mrs May's definition of fair and reciprocal is far, far, far different to what the rest of the population believes, and it will be the same as her idea of Brexit meaning Brexit. Now, our ideas towards Brexit sadly seem to be the same as her predecessor, Mr Heath. These are Britain's greatest natural resources, and yet our coastal communities are treated as expendable, negotiating capital, and her capitulation to trapping Britain in a Brexit transition. And I'll come back to the transition later, but I imagine all of you are well versed with the inadequacies of it already. Now, Mrs May needs, and her politicians, and her MPs, and her Secretaries of State need to stop playing semantics as they have done and live up to the rhetoric, in Mrs May's case, let me be clear, which makes me want to scream on a daily basis every time I hear her say it, and have the decency to stop playing with real people's lives, real people's businesses, and real people's heritage. To many politicians and to many in the political bubble down here, politics is a game that everybody goes home at with their 80 or 100,000 in their pocket at the end of the day. Brexit to our fishing industry is do or die. That is why we emptied the tank for the Thames flotilla, and that is why we will continue to empty the tank right up until the finishing line. She must reverse her capitulation on fishing and categorically promise that we will be entirely free of the disastrous common fisheries policy on the 29th of March 2019, because to fail to do so will squander one of the best opportunities this country has had for generations. Now, fishing is not only the epitome of the acid test of taking back control of our sovereignty, it's a microcosm and an embodiment of the wider ideological, social, economic and political drivers of the entire rationale behind Brexit. We are the poster child. It's more a face for radio than telly, but our industry is certainly a poster child. Now, that's surely what Brexit is all about. It isn't some narrow narrative of simple slogans on the side of a big red magic bus that managed to seduce people from all rationality. Brexit, to my mind, and I think to many, is effectively a rebellion against a globalist, internationalist, big government consensus that has led so much of this country outside of the metropolitan bubble in London to ruination. Our industry communities are just part of that. Now, this doesn't mean Brexit's some sort of inward-looking lifted drawbridge. No, not at all. Brexit is a desire to recalibrate our way at home and in the world to one which puts our nation, our resources, and our people and their welfare first, to reinvigorate the greatness that is in each of us and collectively as our nation as a whole. That is what Brexit is about, not 350 million on a side of a bus. The internationalist and globalist politicians, which miss to denude every facet of this nation for its absorption into the EU, of which our industry has been at the forefront, fail to understand Brexit entirely for this reason. They have convinced themselves that Brexit is an aberration, a virus against their ideological cosy consensus that needs to be curtailed rather than realised. It's the reverse. Brexit is a cry from a nation to stop the ever-increasing doses of the same bad ideological medicine and a consensus that so many feel has failed them, none so more in our coastal communities all around the nation. Whether it's been through conspiracy to denude this nation and the nation-state's resistance, or whether it's cock-up through complicity, we see a continuing scorched earth policy of managed decline and centralisation. That is what we see from our governing class, it's what we see from many of our captains of industry, it's what we suffer from in our own industry. As long as I'm all right, Jack, and can survive, bugger everybody else. But that absolutely sells us short from having what should be, and what Brexit provides the opportunity to be, of a concerted drive. The Americans call it manifest destiny. I don't know what they called it in 1700, but it was inside this nation. And that is what rose us up to the greatness of what this country is, at what we squat inside today. And that is what we can regain with Brexit, and fishing's just part of that. Now, rather than people having the conviction and the courage to admit that policies are driving an attitude of last man standing in Westminster, rather than look to beat a failed system, most people try and bow down and survive within it. We see that in our fishing industry, where the EU applied the ideal of big government, centralised control, to create the failed policies of overarching, remote, bureaucratic centralisation of control, an attempt to bludgeon EU waters together to have an EU fishing fleet fishing EU waters. That was ideologically flawed, and it resulted in the failed common fisheries policy. Now, rather than address the cause of that problem, which is this failure of centralised ideology, their approach over the years has been to generate a plethora of legislative sticky plasters which have driven consolidation in the industry down and down and down. So we've ended up, over the years, not only has the EU been a slap to the face of national pride with the common fisheries policy, but the system's failed abjectly as well. And we obviously see that one of the big manifestations of that is the discarding of hundreds of thousands of tons of fish in order to try and find what you're allowed to keep. Now, anybody that turns around to you and says, the CFP is wonderful, the EU is wonderful, didn't it save fish stocks? Please, pray, tell me, how does catching twice the fish it's meant to be sustainable equal good environmental practice? Now, the EU never to ever walk past a beneficial crisis, has used its ineptitude, although some of us actually believe it was planned out from inception, to end up remoulding the industry, the European-wide industry, into its mould. And of course, that has meant Britain, as an island nation with some of the richest fishing grounds in the world, has effectively been asset stripped. That's right. Now, we pity those in our industry, because there are some in our industry, and the country, who believe the deliberate narrative that this enlightened EU saved us from ourselves. That stocks stood to collapse, and therefore, from a voracious British pirate industry, we're all in the black pearl and called Captain Jack, which stood to wipe the seas clean. Now, this couldn't be a bigger case of fitting facts to a theory, or fitting facts to justify a theory, rather than fitting the theory to the facts. So I just want to trot through to put to bed some of the things you might be hit with gobby lefties in the street. Remainers, beg your pardon. Sorry, Brenda, I didn't mean that as a personal statement. It's just your side seems to have more of them. So the British Home Waters Fleet. We had a distant water fleet, but ignore that. People say, well, the British lost out because we were away pillaging other people's waters, and when we came back, we'd left our waters alone, and the French, very helpfully, had moved in to just look after them for us for 20 years when we spent our time away on holidays at Iceland and Norway and all the rest of it. Bunkum. We had two fleets. We had a distant water fleet that did, as currently the EU has a distant water fleet, went into other nations' waters. We also had a home waters fleet, which you will have seen in places like Lossiemouth, Aberdeen, Arbroath, all those Scarboroughs, Whitbys, all those different towns that were synonymous with fishing in the past, that fished quite happily and quite sustainably for generation after generation. Now, what ended up happening was that meant we kind of followed the Anglo-Saxon market-led approach, where the fleet worked with the seasons, worked with Mother Nature, and if there was a glut came onto the market, market forces corrected, where prices dropped, so you left that species alone. And everybody survived quite happily under that system for before the wars till after the wars. And we were doing fine. Now, it is true technology increased. The technological catching power in the fleet went up multiple factors. Now, the difference is, though, that when the technological factors did increase, Britain had lost her ability to redress that. So, what ended up happening, and as I said earlier on, many of us believe it was through deliberate cunning, has built the CFP through incremental stages. It's a ratchet system, just like the rest of the EU is. Now, many would say these beneficial crises were deliberately engineered, but what it started out with was the principle of equal access to a common resource without discrimination up to the beach. That is the fundamental tenet of the CFP. Everything else is just built on top of that to manage what the EU's managed to acquire for itself. Now, that's what the traitor Ted Heath acquiesced to, whilst disregarding a whole industry, communities, a way of life, and heritage is expendable, despite being warned of the consequences, and we see a replication of that 40 years later. Poor John Ashworth, God love him, he feels he's living in déjà vu, because it's a whole entire repeat of what's going on just now. It's what has happened before. This deliberate narrative that fishing's expendable, they're just 0.5% of GDP, shovel the poor buggers over a cliff. So, we started with equal access to a common resource. What came after that? There was no way back from that all-encompassing smothering point. So, and again, fish played a pivotal and kind of recurring totemic role, not only in our own enmeshment in the project, but of course the decision of Norway, Iceland and Greenland to stay out. So fishing has, the whole way through this, been totemic to the whole EU Brexit process. Now, what ended up happening was when the international fishing limits were extended in the 1970s to counterbalance the increasing technological capacity in the fleet, we recognised ours, because only the member states could do so, but because we had agreed to equal access to a common resource, the EU subsumed that automatically from us. They said, thank you very much, all EU waters, ours now. Now, what ended up happening then was you had equal access to a common resource. So not only did you have a technological increase in capacity in the fleet, which Britain could not address herself, you had the whole EU fleet piling into British waters as well. What the EU then did, not to see a beneficial crisis trot it by, is turn around and said, too much fishing capacity is going on here, too much fishing effort. You caused the problem in the first place. So they brought in a system of quotas. Now, quotas were never designed, I don't believe, as a conservation tool. They were designed as a proportionation tool. It was an easy way on a spreadsheet to say there is X amount of tons of this, X amount of tons of that, and give everybody a nice little slice of it. The problem was, a nice little slice literally meant a nice little slice for Britain. Because in good old Pommy fashion, when we were playing fair and recorded faithfully what we'd been catching, everybody else, especially the Latin countries, added a zero onto the end of all their figures. And that is what has led to the historical imbalance where, although we provide 50% of the waters in the Atlantic to the EU pot, we only get 25% of the resources, even though 60% of the catches, the EU's catches, it's about 60% in our waters and 60% of their catches, are taken from us. Under international law, under a mechanism called zonal attachment, what swims in your waters, or the level of a species that swims in your waters, is yours. So yes, once we Brexit, just as Norway does, just as Iceland does, and everybody else around the world, we will need to work with our neighbours, the EU being one of them, but based on the predominance of fish in our waters, we should get that 60% back. And that is where the 6 to 8 billion comes from. It is a colossal amount of resources. No other nation would give that away. So, of course, not only was Britain locked into equal access to a common resource, not only had they just fiddled half of what should have been our resources away from us, but on top of that, as the system failed, they just kept turning the ratchet rather than address it. Now, the quota system, as everybody, I think, knows, has abjectly failed because fishermen have to discard fish. But before that, before a decent level of enforcement came into play to stop you black fishing, what we call blackfish, that meant illegally landing the fish. Fishermen, from when quotas came in, spent their time running the fish ashore illegally because, to our mind, it was a crime to throw what you'd caught back over the side. All that happened was when the EU stopped you from being able to land blackfish through satellite monitoring, registered ports, and all the rest of it, was the discarding problem. So now we have a situation where we have a policy that is not only taking away our ability to harvest our own natural resources, not only has denuded our fleet in coastal communities, but is absolutely ecologically trashing our waters. We are going to see and spending twice the time and twice the effort to find what we're allowed to keep. It is an absolute nonsense. On top of this, the EU brought in minimum market pricing, so no longer could the market rebalance, but you had the wonder world of minimum prices for your fish. It didn't matter how hard you went or how much you landed, you were guaranteed a price for it, even if it got pink dye thrown on top of it and put in a skip for fish meal. So the EU has trashed our waters, and again, using that as an excuse, we came to the 2000s, the late 90s, too many boats chasing too few fish. And our complicit establishment turned round and worked with the EU to scrap 60% of our fleet. Many of those boats that went to the scrapyard in Denmark, we didn't even have the decency to scrap our own boats. Some of them were only 6 years old. And you saw, because what ended up happening was boats were built on the back of what vessels thought they could do. A good example was the deep water west of Scotland, where fishermen were told, go west, go to the deep water, get out the North Sea, go away and exploit these new stocks, allow the North Sea to breathe. And what happened in 1998? Mr. Blair turned round and gave all the deep water stocks to the French. Those were why those 6-year-old boats went to the scrapyard, and you saw generations of some of the finest fishermen in Britain, probably even in the world, and whole families torn asunder from the industry. And we will never, ever, ever get back not only that heritage, but that knowledge. That is what makes fishermen sick, and that is what will make us fight to the bitter end to stop another Brexit betrayal, because we are not going to be sacrificed again. Now, to make matters even worse, if you believed it could get worse, we've got a massive problem in this country of flagships. What flagships are is EU-owned, big fishing companies, but they register UK shells, UK shell companies. As the British industry struggled to survive, traditionally the British home waters fleet was family-owned. Its struggling families couldn't keep going. Big EU companies stepped in and said, here's money, it's your only way out. And what we have now is a situation you might have seen misreported in the Times and the Express, where around 50% of the UK slice, the domestic UK slice, is owned through these shell companies by flagships. So not only is the EU taking 60% of our resources, of the 40% we do get, they go off with half of that as well. Now the NFFO, which purports to represent British fishermen, is now dominated by these flagships. 70% of the fish that is in the NFFO is owned by these EU companies. And many fishermen, and I will say this in film, because Michael Gove and the Minister and others better get a grip and stop listening to people who are nice and easy to listen to, because many fishermen are enraged that the NFFO is continually feted in Whitehall by mandarins who are less than enthusiastic about Brexit and are quite happy to toddy along with a flagship-dominated organisation because turkeys do not vote for Christmas. And that has got to stop, because the indigenous British industry that has such an opportunity here is being well sold short of what we could actually do with our industry in the future. Now, we have a golden opportunity here, and this is what I want to come to. This and then the transition. The opportunity we have is colossal. It's not only 6 to 8 billion, it's not only tens of thousands of jobs, it is a rejuvenation of whole areas that have little else. Now, even somewhere like Whitby, no offence to anybody that's from Whitby here, but you've got Middlesbrough up the road, which has been economically denuded from its loss of its heavy industry. You've got York, which is an hour and a half over the hill. It is not somewhere that is readily able to access financial services and the wonder world of the City of London, which we're all meant to live off. Without fishing in areas like Whitby, Fraserburghs, and the list goes on, whole areas are going to die. We have the chance to get that back. We have the chance to put into place world-leading management. We have been proposing this to the government for 18 months. Sadly, mandarins, and Sir Humphrey is on the rampage here, have managed to put that in the bottom drawer because, oh dear me, that would upset our quest to stay as closely aligned to the EU as possible. The system we've developed is one where vessels will be limited in time at sea, so they can't overfish the stock. A vessel can only catch so much in a given day, in a given amount of time. So we set an overall limit of time. We understand that there is a great trepidation within the scientific community, the conservationist community, and indeed with our own, that what would then end up happening if you just gave vessels a straight limit of time is you would have what is called a race to fish. People would go out and economics would take over and you would target the highest value species. And that obviously would see stocks like cod and others denuded back down again when we have made tremendous efforts internally as an industry, despite the EU's ineptitude, to build stocks back up to booming as they are just now. So what we propose, and to protect the investment people have put into the allocation system within Britain, is a system of catch compositions. And what this will say to vessels is traditionally you were a monkfish catcher or a cod catcher, or whatever was your predominant species. You could still catch this species, but when you hit the limit you should aim for, you no longer need to discard because you've hit a weight limit. You can run over because it's percentage based, but in exchange you will sacrifice time. And that is a value of time equivalent to the value of the fish. So what this means is there's no economic incentive to race to fish, because if you do so, you will get slaughtered in time. However, if you do catch the wrong species, you can keep it, you sacrifice time, you're finished early, and you go away home. That means less pressure on our stocks, less pressure on our fishermen because they're doing less hours than our boats, and it means we land everything we catch for good science, so we catch less, we land more, and you will see British fishing boom. Now then we come to the value of it, we've covered that, but then we come to trade. And that is the goblin at the centre of the Brexit negotiations. It's a little horrible project fear that niggles away from behind the curtain in the Wizard of Oz to scare us back all into obedience to the EU project. As Peter Shore said, and his speech will be timeless, one of the great Labour men alongside Brendan here, his speech will be timeless forevermore, that he says all they've got, now the promise has been exposed, is fear, fear, fear. Fear that you won't have any food, fear that your industry will collapse, and that is what the establishment has resorted to today. It is bunkum. The amount of our GDP that depends on foreign trade is about 20%. The amount that depends on the EU is about 9%. Is anybody seriously suggesting, even if it could do so, that the EU is going to ban all British exports to the continent? It's ludicrous. We as an industry are prepared for a recalibration. We are prepared to take a dunt in the road. Everybody was prepared for that. By God, Project Fear had an apocalypse about to happen, and we still voted to be free, even if it meant a dunt in the road. It's about time we stopped the tail from wagging the dog. It's about time we said quite clearly, Brexit was not just about economics, as I alluded to at the start. Brexit was giving ourselves the chance, as a great people, to go back out there and discover ourselves again in the world and at home domestically. Yes, we will have cock-ups, as we've always done, but somehow managed to bludgeon our way through, First World War being a prime example. Yes, at times we will fail, but you know what? It will be on our terms for our future and the way we want to be. None so more in our fishing industry. Now, those who say all the time, this is the excuse for fishing, get back in your box, you need their markets. Well, that is not a position of weakness, that is a position of our strength. If the EU is taking and is dependent on 70% of our fish exports, they obviously need our fish. If they lose the ability to do this, we used to do to Iceland, and well done to Iceland for taking their waters back, but if they lose the ability to send tens of thousands of tons of fish from areas like the west coast that don't even touch shared stocks or shared waters on the west coast of Scotland, and send thousands of tons from there, if we get that fish back as well, they are going to need us more than they do just now. We are in a massive position of strength if our spineless government would lift itself off its knees and go for it. Now, this comes to another strand of our island nation's proud heritage, and that is the Royal Navy. I hope the boys from Veterans for Britain are in here. Thank you, madam. Every woman loves a sailor. So, just like our fishing, just like our merchant marine, our Royal Navy's been denuded, whether deliberately or otherwise. Now, the publication the other day of the new River-class patrol boats that have come into service shows what can and is being lost. They're great-looking ships. Fair play to BAE Systems for once. The $6.8 billion from repatriating our fisheries could fund the Royal Navy a versatile fleet of these patrol ships that can be deployed for a range of tasks, not just for protecting our waters. Now, the reason I come to that is because that, to me, just epitomises the ideological approach of what our illustrious ancestors did that made this nation. Sovereignty, national resources, wealth, and defence. A revitalisation of each supporting the other. We need our wealth to pay for our defence, to protect our resources, to generate the wealth. That is what drove this country to greatness, and sickeningly, to me, as a student of history, the Egypts round the corner in Westminster, that's the politest word I could think of there, just do not function on that wavelength. Oh, we're sorry, EU. Can we kiss your hand, EU? Please, little EU. We'll be your good little puppy and not bark too loudly out the side of you. Bugger that. We have a chance, as is epitomised by our fishing and by our Royal Navy there, and it is across the board with Brexit, for a revitalisation of our industry, of our communities, and of our people. Sadly, those waters that the ships are meant to protect have been surrendered without a shot being fired. And why is that? Because of the transition. Now, the transition, I said at the start, and we have been on this since September, God love us, when others wouldn't get it or didn't want to get it. The transition is not just, as I said at the start, an existential threat to what is left of our fishing industry. It is an existential threat to this country as a whole. Now, the reason for that is, under Article 50, it says the treaty ceased to apply. And therefore, at 1 minute past 11 p.m. on the 29th of March, we are free and clear. All obligations that have been accrued under the current treaties cease to apply. And because the EU has agreed that, they have no recourse to come back and say, but. The government knows this, because Jacob Rees-Mogg, as one of the most prominent people, has alluded to it with the Treasury Select Committee. We don't owe them a bean. We don't owe them a penny. We don't owe them a scale of a fish. We owe them nothing. They agreed. We can walk and we can go and take our place in the world and tell them, here's the hoops, you start jumping. Now, the problem with the transition is this. The transition is not an extension of the current membership. The transition will be under a new treaty. It is the relationship after we leave. So 1 second past 11 p.m, we leave with a clean slate. That means we revert to international law, in the case of Fisheries UNCLOS, which confers all our waters and resources upon us. And what we go and do, Ross Thompson even has managed to pick up on this, is 1 second later, we hand this all back to them by agreeing to obey all EU law. In a worse position we are now as a vassal state. And what that means is what we then come under is the Vienna Convention treaties. What the Vienna Convention says in Article 70 is any rights and obligations accrued under a treaty still apply unless otherwise stated. Now, of course, it has been otherwise stated just now because Article 50 says it ceases. But unless there is a clean guillotine clause built into this transition treaty, when the 21 months comes to an end, then the rights and obligations accrued under the treaty continue to apply. And the EU will say, thanks very much, you agreed to letting us back in, you agreed to the current share-outs, we're still coming in to have those. Now, even if the British government argues it through the courts, and the EU's proved wrong, they can pull this out for years. The French make a national sport of going to court and arguing about legalities of treaties. Right? On top of that, you have Article 30 of the Vienna Convention, which says if an old treaty and a new treaty are similar, or the terms are similar, it's absolutely going to be because we're going to adopt a whole acquis, then the old treaty still applies. We are standing into a grievous position where the EU will not just have us over a barrel for 21 months, but could have us over a barrel forevermore. Coming to the fishing quickly, because I know Edward's keen to hurry me up. I've only got a page left, Edward, don't worry. What it really comes to in this, for the fishing in particular, but you could apply this to all other industries, is that when we are there as a vassal state for 21 months, the EU can impose whatever detrimental legislation it pleases. In the case of the fishing, the 12-mile limit that protects our inshore and shell fishermen will cease as soon as we leave, when our current membership terminates, because of course that was a derogation from the principle of equal access under our current membership. They will be able to fish up to the beaches and ruin our inshore fishermen. On top of that, the wording that David Davis, if they think they're clever, they're either think they're clever or they're treasonous, have agreed to. If you read through that and reference back the paragraphs of Article 125 of the Transition Treaty, if you read back through that, when you get back through the paragraphs, it comes back to the Commission shall decide the fishing opportunities for the member states. The EU Commission, during the transition, will have the sole right to decide what we catch and where. And I would wager to suggest they will screw it down as far as possible to take what's left of the British fleet out. The other thing they can do is the discard ban on their failed quota system. And what happens now is rather than addressing the quota cause, they've banned the discard symptom. So what happens now is when you run out of your smallest quota, your meagerest one, you must stop fishing, regardless of what else you have. And the government's own figures, or a public body sea fish, quango, call it what you want, show from their study that 60% of what is left of the British fleet could go bust. Now, you say, why would the EU do that? Michael Gove says we'll all hold hands and sing Kumbaya in good faith. Rubbish. They've never held their hand in good faith yet. They have every incentive to exterminate what's left of us. Why? Because under international law that could be such a benefit to us, under Article 62.2 of UNCLOS, it clearly says that if a nation does not have the capacity to catch all its resources, it shall give the surplus to its neighbours. So if the EU wipes our fleet out through detrimental legislation under the guise of conservation, they step in thereafter and say, very sorry chaps, you don't have a fleet anymore, we're having the lot. We are staring down the barrel of a gun. And I would wager there are plenty other industries out there that the EU has other things that they could trip up and persecute to try and scorch earth us into coming back onto the naughty step. Now, coming to the finish. Coastal MPs, indeed any MPs, must start to listen to the thousands that turned out for us, and I wager thousands more who are sick to the back teeth of what has been done despite the largest vote in British history. They must begin to listen to the public who support not only this totemic industry, or we will go up through the gears, and those protests last Sunday will just be the start. It's important that MPs remember they serve the constituents who elect them, not a dismissive chief whip. If MPs have any inkling of self-preservation amongst the electorate, they must heed what we're saying and put country before the greasy pole of party, and remember that no deal is better than a bad deal, and that coastal constituencies do count. The politicians have been told that the transition is unacceptable, and why? There is no excuse for them to continue with what they're doing. They have been well told. It's now time they honoured the vote and walked away, as it is clear the EU is not prepared to offer us a deal worth more than a packet of Smarties to dissuade others from leaving. If the politicians do shovel fishing away in desperation for any deal, they will be guilty of a conscious second betrayal of thousands of lives, businesses and communities, and I hope they are culled in those constituencies like we will be culled in the 21 months. Fishermen are not going to be thrown to the wolves and treated as expendable a second time. Those protests will just be the start if patriotism, decency and good sense does not prevail. We are determined to defend our way of life by all means necessary, whatever the cost may be to do so, because this for us is do or die. Whether others have the courage or perceive the danger that this transition will be to so much of Britain. The transition threat we face is enormous, and therefore all Brexiteers' resistance against it must also be enormous. Those who entertain ideals of willfully influencing the establishment, who are wholly committed and reconciled to the sellout of the nation, are selling themselves and the country short. Polite letters in the Telegraph and in other areas are not going to cut the mustard. It is time for the whole Brexit movement to come back together, mobilise and go on to the front foot to stop a betrayal of everything that we worked for, everything we voted for, and dare I say it, generations of our ancestors died for, and that is our freedom and our sovereignty. The time has therefore come to take off the silk gloves and fight. No longer can we make only partial and scattered use of the brilliance that is held in each one of us and throughout the Brexit movement. Brexiteers must come together and engage in the battlefield as committedly, as forcefully, with all resources as we did during the referendum, and we have to do it right now. I beseech you all to do so. The greater the fist we make together, the harder the blow in the establishment will be. It is only through re-establishing the pressure that UKIP and many others brought to bear that Theresa May, treason, not Teresa, and the Europhile Blue Labour Party can be deflected from their cause. I ask you all here today, do you believe in this nation and its people as I do, and that we can win this fight to be free? The EU believes we want to capitulate. The EU believes that the British people don't want to be free, but only want capitulation. So I ask you all today, for future generations, do you want your children to be free? Yes. We have only 6 months through our hard work, our perseverance and our endeavours for this great country to be once again free. For behind us stands one of the greatest allies on this earth, and that is 17.5 million of our own people. Thank you very much. God save the Queen.